Hello everyone, today we talk about the Italian communal nobility between the 12th and the 13th century, mostly from the mid-12th to the beginning of the 13th century. As you know, recently I've been making videos on some, let's say, specific polities. Recently it was mostly about the French feudal states. Also in autumn I did something about the same Italian city-states. And yet there is still a lot to do in a broader picture fashion, but still, in fact, also in something that is still local, but also connects the dynamic but to the wall. So I plan in the future now to look at European countries and polities specifically to get a bit more in depth in that regard. And still we need these videos about understanding the broader mechanisms. As you know, we made a lot of videos about the Italian communes. This was especially evident in the first couple of years of Schwerpunkt. Recently maybe it's gone a bit more diluted. But this chapter, as you know, is particularly important, relevant, delicate, and tremendously overlooked. Again, mostly in popular culture, always compared to popular culture. It's not that I make a j'accuse towards like anybody's ignorance per se. But again, when somebody gets interested in the Middle Ages, and they should get it in, first of all, right at a basic level. And there are some basic topics and major pages in medieval European history manuals that cannot really be skipped because somebody doesn't like to see the broader picture. And again, there are so many topics that escape completely the attention. I mostly focus, as you understand, my channel revolves mostly around let's say mostly French, German, and Italian history. I guess there's a specific reason for that in the broader picture. I don't know if you kind of realize this, but in fact there are so many other realities that we haven't discussed and that are crucial. In any case, these ones, in my opinion, that are central for not just the construction of a European school today, that is to say, first of all, Europeans and hopefully worlders in general should have a objective understanding of history, and therefore kind of a shared homogeneous one, right? Single thought does not exist. It exists only science and things that make sense on the base of evidence. When it comes to personal opinion, subjectivism, relativism, frankly, aside from the phenomenon in a broader realization of the same, has no value of any kind, and it shouldn't even be taken in consideration continuistically, let's say. And the Italian communes are probably one of those topics that, again, suffered the most of this forgetfulness. And we will not digress on the causes, but we have already explained abundantly, in fact, why this period is crucial and why the mechanisms of these city-states to be, because especially talking about the second half of the 12th and beginning of the 13th century, we're not exactly in front of a city-state, right? And talking about the nobility is perhaps the best way of showing this, understanding who was effectively in charge of this reality. So we are actually in a crucial moment for the Italian communes. As you know, the second half of the 12th century was the period, the decades of the First Lombard League and the wars with Frederick Barbarossa. So some of the most intense chapters in medieval European warfare. By the way, I made, I think, the very first months of Schwerpunkt, something about the Battle of Legnano. But those are things we will have to come back on, because that's the horror that I realized I was saying before, that I made more than 1,300 videos and we still haven't talked about properly in detail about an entire chapter about the first and the second Lombard League, or the Peace of Constance, or even just yeah, we made something about communal warfare here and there, but there is a lot to look at. Also, we made dramatical view about the Norman kingdom that also had some interconnection, and also especially later with the Swabian rule. But we have come to discussing gradually. Hopefully, we will cover this. And the Italian communes at this point were fairly young, right? It was less than a century that the communal institution as such was around. The commune was essentially as the name tells itself, was a sort of guild, in fact, an association that stressed, in fact, the unity, the cohesion of what was effectively the ruling class that since, in fact, the 12th century had defined itself as the consulship, right? The consular class, actually, that was that took the name essentially from the ancient Roman magistracy, the collegial one, and that actually represented more broadly the head of the government, but the richest, more powerful individuals in the cities that overlapped unavoidably with what was in lifestyle essentially a chivalric military elite, right? Just like in the rest of Europe, in spite of the looser feudal bond, right? So this is the other characteristic, right? That you see that in every European country, you see England, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, every the political institutional profile was different, but when you go look at what the rulers were about factually, materially, even, you realize they were the knightly elite in a way or another, right? Independently from the juridical status, from the places of government, the level of development. At the end of the day, it was just the knightly class in many ways. And in Italy especially, this had taken a kind of a more egalitarian character on the base of census. That is to say, it was not much about a progressed noble lineage that would make the ruling class. It was about power. It was about, could you fight on horseback with heavy weaponry and, waging, campaigns effectively. That was what made up the ruling class. And the consular class, in this sense, was not made up just by the milites. That is to say, these were the knights who were at the head of these guilds, of these factions that, however, contained also, notaries, merchants, right? So there were extended clans that ruled the city, in fact, as different factions that at this point were not kind of unitarily meant. I mean, yes, the commune existed because there was a sense of, there was a necessity due to the metus hostilis that would have to make the city exist against its enemies, and by being united, like everybody who waged real power, let's say, in history needs to have in the first place. And at that point, if naturally somebody was powerful enough, economically and militarily, etc., these were essentially the ruling class that would define itself increasingly as such. And you understand that in a context such as the one of the imperial invasion and the Lombard League, such leadership was needed in quite consistent fashion. I say that the Italian communes at this point were not city-states because, in fact, they were ruled by these clans, right? That, as we will see, had essentially the profile of a mob, right? Even just by lifestyle, by sense, of honor, of feud, of, let's say, this bloody, properly mindset. It was not different, in fact, from any other knight, feudal lord of medieval Europe in this sense. And that embodied definitely the superiority of these individuals over the rest of the population, that naturally was not all framed within the, in fact, the nobiliar clienteles, right? And that was growing under the guidance of them, but also, as we will see, defining themselves further as something else. In any case, This is a period, as you know, in European history where the commoners, that would provide the infantry, the petites, in the armies, as also in the communal ones, were not able to essentially challenge the military, literally military in the sense of the milites, of the rule on the battlefields and in council, right? They were subordinated to them, right? Were relegated, if you want, in a condition of moral and material inferiority that was represented by the feudal hierarchy, by the communal government, and etc. And the consuls definitely were the best of the community. I mean, they really brought with them not just this capacity of warring, but also of governing, right? They knew how to do that, and the rest of the people essentially benefited from this. Of course, as the clans were in charge, they would retain most of their privileges. For example, the milites were essentially repaid for the losses of equipment and mounts in campaign, right? Which at some point generated also some frauds, etc. Because there had to be a communal office proposed exactly to this control, to see before the expeditions whether the horses were the ones that eventually the militaries could claim to have been crippled or not, because it was an enormously costly affair, right? Say this was the prerogative of the knights. That it was like a bit also in the Roman world back in the day. You know that the Equites had, contrarily wise to the idea of the citizen soldier, that had to just the honor and duty of fighting as a citizen, also some extra benefit for example, the maintenance of horses, right? Some war horses at their expense, because there was the conviction that, as existed in the Middle Ages, that the knight per se was some sort of sacrally superior individual. What is fascinating about the Italian communes is that these political organizations had been born out of we couldn't say even a purely military nature, right? The warlikeness of the central northern Italian city-states was something renowned. I mean, since the beginning of the communes themselves, these were communities of citizens in arms, right? And they were freemen as such, and this is a prerogative that had maintained throughout even the feudal era, because since Longobards times, everybody in the land was traditionally free, which is something that we think maybe is the other way around, right? It was the southern Europeans that were kind of more habituated to the lord of the Romans, the latifundium, etc., and the north were, the Germanic world, where people were free traditionally. It was actually the other way around. By these centuries, the 12th century, traditionally Italians were freemen, right? It was properly a political institutional practice from which, juridically speaking, the people were normally free, and this had to do not just with the highest per capita wealth in the world at this point individually, so a greater real freedom properly, but also the continuity in the public institutions that, again, since Longobards times especially, had functioned tremendously well and had been at the base of throughout all the Carolingian, the Saxon time, the revival of Roman law later on. And so that's why also Frederick Barbarossa and his milieu, when they arrived in Italy after a long period of vacancy of the empire, after the defeat of the industrial investiture controversy, they were literally shocked, culturally speaking, by seeing what these Italian subjects, Italian communes had properly become in terms of political social development and things, again, that the north of the Alps was unconceivable, such as, in fact, a polity of commoners that had fundamentally not received any feudal office to rule the land by the emperors, could essentially dictate law to some really noble lineages in the countryside and expand so powerful with an army again that they were massive at the time. They were fighting basically all the time long. It was an incredible, as you know, military development. Even we stress mostly infantry, right? Saying, this was the war of the commoners of the Republic. Not quite really. Again, the head were always the knights, right? And these were mostly military systems that were developing with an incredible level of collective training, right? Also in military engineering capacities. I think, as you know, at this point, the French, the Italians were really pioneering even the military technology and training that were becoming quickly the most dynamic military systems in Europe. And there was definitely a different military culture as well. I mean, the Germans would have been, especially at this time, dramatically overloaded still in that sense of the individuality of the warrior, of the knight, of the charge. In fact, German imperial cavalry really, was extremely effective in Italy. They scored much of a success, but against the entire system, right? They could raze to the ground the largest city in Europe, Milan, and the Milanese would simply rebuild it from scratch in a few years. I mean, it was a level of resources and properly of resupply and growth that was unprecedented. Again, I think this, in general, I say this about Western Europe, narrowly meant in the High Middle Ages, that I think in relative terms, doesn't find equals in the history of mankind, right? Industrial Revolution, yes, of course, but that because there were the machines, etc. So you can understand the context would bring to that. But again, if you try to make a comparison between the context, like with an agricultural pre-industrial system, I think in Western Europe really never was. I'm not aware of any other country that achieved that ever. And the Italians, in this sense, were capitalizing probably within the same Western Europe the highest amount of wealth per capita, especially, right? So in qualitative terms, the greatest amount of enrichment probably ever seen in the history of mankind. It was, it is evident. Even if you look at the images I'm posting here, the level of already pre-humanistic temper, artistic development of properly engineering the stone buildings, it was massive, was infrastructurally immense. And to hope to tame this system, especially just through brute force, etc., was backfiring. That's what is effectively Frederick Barbarossa was to find out the hard way. And so you understand, as a consequence, the motivation also of the elites to resist, to maintain control on this world. There were many Italians who were naturally serving in imperial armies as peers, even often those, in fact, noble lineages of still, in fact, of feudal origin and of feudal rights that were happier of an imperial rule and hoping for cooptation from the side of Germanic emperors, etc. And they also show their ethics. There is, in the same Italy, a kind of divide in this regard. I mean, Lombardy, for example, would remain, in spite of this enormous, in fact, military development, also of the commoners, etc., of the infantries, would always remain kind of nobiliar nature, right? The great nobles of Lombardy. It was never like a fully popular government like in the 13th century in Lombard. Whereas, I don't know, areas like Tuscany were kind of different, even just by cultural temper. I made videos about this difference, especially between Milan and Florence, and during humanism, that the idea that was kind of a tyrannic model meant in the neutral classical sense for the Milanese signory, and kind of a republican one for Florence, was actually a big hypocrisy. But because power was exercised in ways that were viciously oligarchic, like in fact all pre-industrial societies, and that were, however, extremely functional in that sense. But there is also here the idea that, especially in the 12th century, it's evident when you look, and that's why we talk about the militarists today, because that's the side where you can see it more strongly. The idea that still the nobility, the lineage, the strength, the blood, the honor, the chivalry was and in fact the the very hard and violent lifestyle was at the root of universal dominance, right? This was the older Indo-European ethos that lived within this. The same Italians were very sensitive to this idea, for example, of the ethnic origins themselves. I mean, even if you look at especially these military clans, they cared about that idea of the stock of the ancient origins. Many of them trace back their origins to some German or French noblemen. And historically, that was this, right? There weren't just many mercenaries around, but historically, Italy had been ruled by the Lombards, been ruled by the Franks, the Ottonians, and even though none of these peoples fundamentally maintained like a kind of control on the country, if not by essentially becoming the country themselves, like the Lombards, whereas most of the Carolingians and the Ottonians were an external power that didn't quite last as a if supported by the local communities. There was an evident connection and intersection and kind of commonality between. It was at the root of all traditional cultures, right? Probably the universal bond. These people didn't care about from which country really you came from which lineage, from which individual came from, because that was the most important political and social divide that effectively substantiated the moral force. And that's why the consular class was so important, because they embodied literally the aristoi, the aristocrats, the best ones, the ones that had proudly, won the imperial insignia and defeated, in fact, the Germanic emperor, and having by himself their own liberties sanctioned institutionally within the empire, because they'd been won on the battlefield, and that, as you know, in a religious military sense, was the sanction of a right in a war like that. So we shouldn't be, and this is what we should try to see in every after basically a couple of centuries of forced kind of progressivism and modernism and liberalism, to understand that these societies were had nothing to do with a democratic or a republican ethos, and fortunately so, because the best they produced when they were really guided by powerful leaders. That again, doesn't necessarily mean that these powerful leaders were such in virtue of a weakness of the rest of the people at all. That's in fact why, the commoners in Italy produced the best infantry in Europe during the 12th, 13th century, but these infantry were still under the local knights. And the Italians would effectively never score a purely infantry victory, like, later on the Flemish, the Swiss, because still the system was kind of more advanced. It was still better structured, more hierarchized, and more, in fact, statal in nature. In fact, at the time, later on, when these things happened, we talk of real city-states. And in fact, as you know, a modern government that will make school in political theory in modern Europe fundamentally have developed exactly from these centers. So, what I wanted to stress in this regard is that the entire community was made up of freemen. That is to say, the commune, as long as you were a citizen, you were free. And as such, originally, you were considered, in the best of the Roman and German juridical tradition, a nobleman. That is to say, being a freeman was being a nobleman, because you effectively detained the imperium within the fact you could bear arms. Right? So when the German armies arrived in Italy to bring order, they realized something that in their country had never seen. That is to say, the commoners being people that were actually free, but not somebody's possession. Right? This was true in Germany even for the knights. The ministeriales were essentially non-freemen. So was an enormous deal. Was actually a punch in the eye. It was something monstrous. I mean, Frederick Barbarossa was very, very clever to exploit the the best of this civilization, especially from a juridical point of view, the Bolognese school of Roman law that would entrust the emperor, the Roman emperor, because that was the point, full power on the papacy, on paper, or parchment was still more common at this time, and but wouldn't actually understand this world deeply, and that's again great part of the reason why the same Lombard League at the end of the day prevailed, because you can't really fight a war without understanding the politics, the history, the society of the enemy that you're fighting, right? It doesn't make any sense. And in any case, that's a completely different chapter that, again, I hope we will be talking about soon, the wars between Barbarossa and the Lombard League, because those are really cool, right? They are very heavy stuff, but it's radically brutal stuff, by the way, and one of the unforgettable chapters in European warfare, medieval times. So what happened naturally is that, however, this hierarchy was understood. I mean, the fact of being a freeman didn't mean that you were equal. That's yet another mistake we make as modernists. Of course, the militaries were better, were more powerful, were more capable. Simply, they were more intelligent. I mean, let's be honest about this. They were the ones who controlled the government, the military expeditions, who organized the whole freaking thing. On average, of course, were the most intelligent, the ones that understood better the connection between politics and war. And this elite had all the moral, material superiority to prevail. We're not going to look at this because it pertains mostly to the beginning of the Italian communes. We made videos about that. But there was a first phase in the rise of the commune. It was just a universitas, like any other guild, association, corporation in Europe, like any other that had justified, let's say this had to be done in part also in the face of the emperor that had kind of used the trick himself before. The fact that the commune was acting on behalf of the episcopal power, because in the Italian city-states, of course, the city was normally the seat of a diocese, right? Historically, in the ecclesiastical administration since Roman times, and the bishops had been invested by the Ottonians historically in their rule in Italy of the comital prerogatives. So, in other words, all that pertained to the secular rule of the district, of the city district, as it was this was already present in Roman times, Lombard times, Frankish times, because they use the same administrative repartitions. The rule of the law on that piece of land that had originally been entrusted also to the bishop, that was not quite literally a count, but had owned that comital prerogative. So the commune cleverly said, well, that now we're taking, over that prerogative, so that it's always of the bishop. Usually there were fierce struggles with the bishop as well, because bishops were powerful, right? They had clienteles, they had armed men, and so on. But the commune was more powerful. Two, the cities were growing fast, and also the military class was actually being replenished by the traditional rural seigniories. So as we'll see, this was going on continuously, actually, and even increasing in these later times. And so the bishop had effectively been ousted by the de facto control of the city and its district, and the commune was even taking it, the next step forward, which is factually also what triggered in part the same imperial intervention in Italy, that was the fact that these communes were starting to invade other cities' districts and making regular wars with their neighbors, right? Was it initially, especially during the 12th century, was typically seasonal warfare, etc. The wars with Barbarossa would trigger much more interesting changes, because they, of course, increased dramatically the political compaction and military, say, at least the belligerent, the military, the rate of military activity of this country was already quite high, as we were saying before, but that taught the cities especially to coordinate themselves among one another in an explosion again of science, of culture, of technology, of economical practices. I mean, the same leagues themselves were speaking the same language of the universities, were associating on the basis of the enormous trade flows that they controlled. And in fact, if you really look at, well, even in these pictures I'm presenting here, these are images you can find mostly about the militas that I've searched in here, are all across communal Italy, from mostly churches, as you see here. And you realize that from Rome to the Alps, even the artistical style is identical. It's dramatically homogeneous. I mean, these were all different city-states, but within themselves, they were dramatically homogenized, right? And in fact, they produced a culture that was truly Italian in its properly national sense. At the time, they wouldn't quite, we're talking about the High Middle Ages. It wasn't like an idea of nation. And Italy, as you know, is one of those countries in Europe that kind of arrived just to the national unification in the 19th century. But the idea of the existence of a national culture was self-evident, right? Abroad, this land had been known as the Langobardia, as Italy as such, and there wasn't much of a distinction there, and it was probably actually one of the most culturally homogeneous areas in Europe, and exactly because of this dramatic intertwinement and exchange, etc. In fact, surprisingly or unsurprisingly, I would say enough, all the various institutional stages of the evolution of the communal governments basically came, these essentially were 30 autonomous, if not de facto independent city-states, all basically in the same years at once. And these weren't ruled by anybody. There wasn't a king. There was an overlord. Nothing. Right, so that tells you alone how much they were achieving, and it's in fact that's why this is one of the single most impressive pages in medieval Europe, because factually it's basically the only place where this thing happened. No other country manifested even the same tendency. Not even southern France, that was kind of heavily urbanized and traditionally also similar and in strong contact with central and northern Italy, ever got close even to these levels of and that's why, in fact, I don't know, the feudal monarchy there from the north took over as the French conquered Occitania. Here the thing was another kettle of fish, let's put it this way, and the commune had easily taken over. I mean, this system was so effective that all the uncertainties deriving from the political institutional coexistence with the traditional powers were surpassed. The commune began literally to dictate law on its own. And this is also why so much of juridical development was sparked, not just because of the obvious needs in transactions, in definition of property, of rule, etc., properly because they had to find also in the international law, in fact, a justification for this that was difficult to find, but it was also extremely refined in the logic that they provided it with. And so this is yet another aspect. That is, traditional powers here didn't really have, they had a constant interference in the system because, of course, the one side sided with the was for the emperor, and for the papacy. There was a tremendous, as you know, back and forth of this. Some of the initial pro-imperial cities, once they saw what the Germans were really doing, once they arrived in Lombardy, actually, joined the Lombard League to fight them. But there were also, aside Italy at this time, and exactly because of this chivalric military elite, was extremely open to, for example, French cultural influence, literature, as a bit all of Europe. I mean, the same Germany. Think about the Minnesänger, etc. but also, I don't know, during the campaigns of Frederick Barbarossa, it was said by Byzantine sources that was essentially there were Byzantine agents in every single Italian city to counter, to sabotage the German supplies, etc. It was a dramatically complex thing. Again, even the dichotomy Italian-German is actually very forced. It's not correct. It was not a national struggle, but there was some undertone of this that was kind of evident. Also, for the aforementioned reasons, but also for what, in fact, mostly the imperial papal policy had been about. And this pre-existing ethnic divide and different political, cultural development that would, for which these two peoples that were effectively the most important of the empire, I mean the Germans and the Italians, were, forcing, by fighting against each other, were kind of forcing also to understand each other, to hybridize in culturally speaking. In fact, as I often tell, the investiture controversy was one of the single most impacting civilizational event in the history of mankind, easily, hands down, in Western civilization, first of all, but as a consequence in the history of mankind, because it happened in the struggle between these two areas, and there is no way around this. And that's how the empire had been formed. And in fact, what is also fascinating is how, in fact, nobody ever disconfessed each other. Nobody said the empire didn't have to exist. The Lombard League wasn't fighting at all to destroy the empire, to renegade the empire, to secede from the empire. There was none of that. We're actually fighting for their own prerogatives within the imperial system and the law that was enforced there. But still, in fact, also a juridical background is really needed, because customary law, public prerogatives there were being defined, interestingly enough, with important influences also from neighboring lands, such as especially France, Sicily, that were, as you know, quite advanced in terms of state building, and that reflected in this world. The main obstacle in say for the individual cities had been mostly surpassing the let's say the episcopal obstacle in a way, which was done largely successfully and for good, telling the truth. But it didn't bring to say political institutional stability or crystallization. In fact, the state had yet to come. Why did this happen? Well, because the communal system had to coexist with new political aggregations within the same city that were the expression, in turn, of economical and patrimonial interests, ambitions of groups, factions, and classes in contrast, that essentially compromised the same stability and institutional unity of the commune. In fact, we have already talked about the divide existing between the milites and the populus, which would become evident exactly in the interwar period, like between the 12th and the 13th century, between the first and the second Lombard League, that is to say, the wars against Frederick I and Frederick II, respectively. And why? Well, in part, this it's important not to just read it as a class struggle, because, of course, yes, the milites were obviously the equivalent of the feudal elite in the city, and the populace were, kind of the common citizens. But aside from the fact that the common citizens, again, were freemen, that were also the serfs, and those who were working for them in the countryside, that were, in fact, it was the place where both, in fact, the milites and the populace owned the land, and the fact that, again, within the same militia clans, there were lots of what you would call civilians, even though the divide was not really there in a modern sense, that were, again, notaries, merchants, etc. And in the populace also there was an elite, so much that even they could afford to, they would at some point, if I don't know, a merchant that was part of the populace became so rich that he could afford to fight on horseback, he would, of course, immediately join the militia, if he could. But of course he was connected to the populace still before. So that's how hybrid the system was, and how especially the vertical divide was important. That is to say, the clans hated each other's guts. Because again, it was like mafia, right? It was like, imagine various clans that share the cake, and then somebody, screws up for some reason, and therefore there is some retaliation, there is some bloody affair in the streets, urban battles, shops destroyed, a reason for which the people began to get fed up by this and start to develop some paramilitary units to kind of counter the knights, especially in the narrow city streets, where infantry could really provide for a much greater obstacle as opposed to open field where the cavalry would always dominate. And we're talking about, in fact, some of the most radically violent chapters of urban warfare that you can imagine in medieval times, with literally, people again having this house towers that were the seats of the factions. They lived inside, like they were effectively castles within the city, right? The entire city, it's as if it had been made up of different castles, of many castles. It could be tens, right, or more, hundreds. Even if you look at today, the Italian landscape doesn't quite show it anymore, because of course these were medieval structures. They fell at some point, but in the most famous instances, think about San Gimignano in Tuscany, or in Bologna, for example. You can see these enormous things. They're still like a skyscraper, so they still stand. And to give you an idea, if you think that the landscape was basically obscured, how thick all these towers were all around, by even the sheer amount of power and wealth that these clans had, and how much of this could unleash just by violence. If you read the local chronicles that tell you stories, are terrifying, right? Including, I don't know, bishops bringing their own catapults into the gardens of private people to bomb the surrounding towers of things like this. I mean, they were, again, you understand why also they developed so much in terms of military organization, and how much they could put in terms of fighting resources. And the clan lifestyle here is crucial, really, because mostly the first Lombard League had showed, especially in battles like Carcano, Legnano, if you know the military history of them, we'll talk about them at some point, that the infantry was ever more important, right? We literally have here some proofs of infantry literally fighting alone against the knights, not just in desperate situations when their own knights had bailed out, like at Legnano, and they eventually came back, because also the infantry resistance against the imperial cavalry, but literally that they would operate seemingly in a separate way. This is also very fascinating because I personally specialize exactly in this. I mean, I have a PhD exactly in early 14th century Western European. It's technically infantry tactics, but of course you cannot study that without accounting cavalry and also the properly missile troops that do not count like an arm in their own, but they are also quite relevant to conceptualize in a separate fashion. And the degree, again, of autonomy of infantry that there is in Italy during the 12th and 13th century is something that I've never really seen elsewhere, right? Unless we're talking about those times where cavalry still hadn't taken over completely, or in the least feudalized kind of fringe areas of the West, but where in fact, because cavalry was kind of weaker, right? But this idea that the infantry would just even perceive itself as opposed to the milites and having the ambition and the aggressiveness to literally there is an instance in Carcano, for example, where the Lombard infantry was broken by German cavalry, but German cavalry had eventually to go fight against the Lombard cavalry, and so the infantry was broken, but it reformed and went on to loot the German camp, which is something actually pretty strange, because normally when an infantry formation was broken, like it was broken for good, right? You don't come back to, but it's something extremely, it points to kind of a moral force of these units that do not really have much of an equivalent in these at the time also it's hard to get these details from even pitched battles, because really, mostly the accounts are vague. In fact, the same Italian historiography at the time was quite advanced to even provide with this kind of detail. But mostly the other countries, the protagonists are the horsemen, are the knights. Nobody cares really about the infantry. Even some of the most important battles fought in the 13th century, where infantry was really growing, even more important than this time. You see, there is none of the mention, Markfeld, or the same Benevent or Tagliacozzo. Those were some of the largest also battles, and we know there was infantry, but the accounts do not talk about that. So what happens in Lombardy is really, really meaningful, and it's obvious that after the war, these Peditas began to say, you know what, we can counter the imperial cavalry in open field, and we have those guts, right, enough guts to do that. Why don't we do it against the militas in our own cities that oppress us, that essentially behave like mobsters, that destroy our business because they always have to clash against one another for privileges that effectively are keeping us under. And so this is what began to happen, and the second Lombard League against Frederick II, in fact, was kind of put this even more on the fore, in a sense. And those were the years, in fact, where the populace emerged as a political faction, that is to say, properly, the anti-militia, right? The anti-militia, the militia meant in what it was meant militia in medieval times, properly the militas, the knights. And the events that pertain to that phase we have seen in other videos, and we will look at in further and also in greater detail at some other point. But what is important is to stress that even in that instance, actually, what happened to the populace is that it began to provide itself of its own militas, that many militas, properly, many noblemen, even passed to the populace. Because at the end of the day, this was a great business, was the great commune, was the great opportunity to rule. And so, if a faction or a class or whatever or a group was more powerful, why not siding with them, right? Instead of having your house razed to the ground and your family killed or expelled, exiled, etc. So what you actually see up to that point, and so always, as we were saying before, in Italy, the infantry the people would never take over. This is, again, extremely important, because there is not that degree of properly lower class management and kind of even motive for kind of a subversion of a revolt, if not a revolution. I mean, this is really something else from what happened, I don't know, at Courtrai in 1302, where literally the commoners, merchants, peasants that had not taken a weapon in their hands up to the day before managed to defeat in open field alone as pure infantry. Yes, there was some knightly advisor, but again, we're a purely infantry army, the flower of French cavalry. But that was more like kind of a revolution. It was properly an independentistic feeling, also the Flemish against the French, etc. Of course, in Italy, none of this ever happened, because again, basically the only invaders they had to counter were the Germanic emperors that were still, however, operating with, yes, there was a substantial German element there, that, as we've seen, also was quite good in military terms, but essentially was a fight to win over the same Italians, right? And hence, recently we made that video about the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, because that's also what Frederick II, differently from his grandfather, began to understand, in spite of maintaining this extremely ruthless face that his grandfather had towards the Lombards, right? Because he really didn't think that what they were doing was acceptable from an imperial perspective. But again, there was also an enormous anti-Hohenstaufen propaganda in Germany, because all the various vassals that didn't want really to participate really the German nobility was never really interested in Italy that much. It was mostly an imperial thing. It was actually a clever one, because had the German emperors tamed Lombardy, they would have objectively recreated the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean and ruled from there, and also kind of leaving Germany a bit on its own, like a peripheral province. But it was evident, especially at the time Frederick said, that the resources were just not available. Right? We're talking primarily of moral resources. Like, who could make that effort? Even just economically or demographically. It was insane. And again, because this was an exception that nobody had ever really seen or before or understood, exactly for this reason. But it's also true that these conflicts were fueled by the absolute growth, in fact, of the cities themselves, which is the same reason why the struggles became ever sharper and kind of even constructive in the outcome. Right, the decline of the communes would happen properly in a political social sense only in the first half of the 14th century, where the seigniories take over, where probably there are regional states, where you have still one city that, however, is the largest, most powerful one, that finally manages to create a state by subduing the ones around. And we made videos also about that. But at this point, where the commoners, the peasants, were beginning to say, well, we should check nobiliar power and the one of their cavalry, etc. The milites were also growing in power in absolute terms. Surely in relative terms, they were kind of decaying. This happened for, first of all, we witness thickening and strengthening of the nobiliar factions. But what they would be called in Italian as consorterie. That comes from consors, consortes plural, that in Latin stands for literally those who share the same destiny, the same fate, because these were sworn association with a code of honor. Again, when I ask you to picture the mafia, I'm literally talking about that, because as I often tell you, there wasn't anything but that before the modern state. Right? So in order to understand the ancien regime altogether and properly feudalism or whatever, you have to enter not like, in a mindset, not like the mob, but exactly the mob, because this is exactly what it was. Totally, purely comprehensive. Again, in also much larger times. This doesn't apply to the Middle Ages. This is what it was, again, how normally every community organized itself. And these factions, these associations, were growing, not just in number, but also from the within, demographically speaking. This was due to again, these were open clans, right? They were, we called them families, but they were like medieval families, like something extended, like a clan. They could be hundreds of thousands of people that would associate themselves. And of course, they would marry into each other and all these kind of things to strengthen the bond, living within the same section of the city that, again, was fortified like an enormous infrastructure exactly for that. They had their own magazines, their own weapons depots, all this stuff. And mostly, as again, considering the very low demographic growth of the time, of course, pre-industrial society, mostly not for greater natality, but for the immigration of little and great rural lords that happened spontaneously by attraction of the city, also in an active sense from the city. I mean, as a consequence of the gradual subjugation of the seigneurial forces of the district at the hands of the commune and of its army. And so it was obvious, right? And in a way, the more people you got in, and the more manpower you had, if you were rich enough to arm them, to give them sort of cohesion and a reason for it, they would stick to your side, and so that's why also violence would escalate, because these were not just bunch of bands. These were there were kind of small armies within each clan that were complete also of any kind of tactical segment, because again it was from the top elite knight to the crossbowmen to catapults to you can imagine melee infantry that was again developing as well, importantly. And again, the allegiance varied for the most kind of complicated reasons that you can think of. I mean, banally speaking, thinking about even like Italy is not extensionally so large. I mean, if you pick, especially because most of it's the Apennine in running like a spine across the peninsula. But so the highest demic concentrations still today, I think Italy is the country with the highest demic concentration in Europe. It's because they are concentrated in Lombardy and in Tuscany, and in fact are the most important centers in this phase. And within the city, right? If you ever visited a medieval town, you have something that has the resemblance of it, you realize how tiny the spaces were. I mean, how compressed people lived in the past in general. And imagine, for this reason, if you have on this relatively small surface 30 city-states, but you always have basically, I don't know, let's say 4 or 5 cities around you that are potentially interacting with you also in a hostile fashion. So even just imagine this aspect. That is to say, the various quarters or sestiers, depending on how the city was built, was subdivided. By the way, it was expanding beyond the Roman ring, building a second, a third one sometime. The various quarters were normally made up of those people who controlled the land was immediately outside their own gate in that section of the city, right? So just thinking in political terms, the difference that it made, whether you had to fight from one side against, say, in one direction or the other, against that city or the other, for how that would impact your city district. Because if the enemy is coming to raid, just as you are doing in his own case from that direction, those lands that are in that, in the line are going to suffer the most. So, or maybe you are the one who is hoping to expand exactly in that direction. So just even on the basis of this factor, think about how many subdivisions and political directions could there be. Some that is sort of kind of socioeconomical struggle between the classes. Some the broader international situation, papacy versus empire, and the various changes that happen in that dramatically unstable world, where these were polities that had to cope constantly with that. Now, from the mid-12th century, the milites began to make up some, in fact, associations with a strictly military and noble bias, right? They're mostly aimed at, in fact, strengthening their political cohesion and military power, right? And you find even things that are reminiscent of the ancient comitatus, of the war bands of the migration era, like some of them, they were always based on note of field. It was mostly the younger men that had also to prove themselves to become better knights. I don't know, there was the Company of the Wolf, or the one, I don't know, the inspired to Arthurian cycles, all these kind of things. And they stressed, in fact, the nobility of itself, right? In a sense of kind of a almost racial superiority because of their own. Still, the idea of the imperium, of the religious military tradition of the ancient times. I mean, the winner is the vanquisher, is the one who has God's blessing and that has the right to rule the land. And again, they are mobsters because they are bands of especially of young men that have to affirm themselves, that basically spent their entire life training with weapons and there is also in the courtly ideas also behind it, at least the reality, the crudity of it also. These were highly sexed realities, highly, these people were also extremely, I don't know, but were also artistically versed, right? It turns out, even just we know it, modern psychology, that the peak of male creativity coincides with the peak of male crime. It's not a surprise, I don't know, that the most talented Minnesenga were some of the most brutally and unscrupulously and traumatically violent people in the knights, mercenary, that you could find out there, right? You say, but how can a person that butchered people without blinking and batting an eye, could write such highly poetic content, could be such artistic individual? This was their lives, and it was normal. It was their, simply they would leave. There was no other way for a nobleman to leave, because it was the pure expression of their own superiority in a mystical, universal, military, religious sense. It was everything blended. And this was true for the entire European nobility, right? And this is extremely resourceful. We've seen it also in that series we have made for the 700th anniversary of Dante's death. What Dante himself, as the greatest poet in medieval history, was really like. We think of the poet was sitting at a desk, right? He was actually a knight. He fought among the cavalry elite in the first line, almost about to get killed in the process, right? Would have lost basically one of the great. Who knows how many geniuses we have lost actually in the same way in the process. He was a moneylender, was a diplomat, he was a politician. These were these men. Incredible men. Again, never underestimate what the aristocracy and why the aristocracy existed in that world in the first place. What the Ancien Regime in origin was really there for, and what it was really about. Before it, we kind of decided to not just to end. It kind of declined itself, of course, over time with secularization, modernization. But we kind of removed the memory of all the superior beliefs that were at the root of it. And nobody teaches you this stuff in school, because our world is being properly engineering this largely because of some specific political bias for making you eliminating from your mental horizons the awareness of the fact that the entire world was like that before, and that it did work, and that we actually rest on the base of the achievements of that system. And this nobility was prevalently landed in terms of economical base, of course, because again the power of the city actually stood in the wealth of the country, of the district, and that's where in fact the nobles had their own possessions, and also the citizens in general had their own possessions. So this is entailing, of course, the presence of castles also in the countryside and so on. This would become actually an important problem when the commune began to epurate part of the nobility, because this could simply escape in the countryside and starting a fierce resistance from the hinterland, very often backed by rival cities that the commune at some point didn't really have the strength to extirpate. And that's mostly how the signories, the Italian lordships, rose eventually as a form of military protection. And the nobility so maintains in the city that chivalric military lifestyle, that so much problem it causes, and it also maintained the rights, the banal rights, the rights of bondom on the villages of the countryside. So it was like a world straddling across the city and the countryside. Again, the city in many ways was a universe within itself, but it's also being built as such, especially from the perspective of the aristocracy. The world is larger, right? There are greater interconnections, also internationally, by the way. And so this connection is relative. The importance is the wealth, right? The nobility owned castles in the city. They owned castles in the countryside. And very often they were, in fact, more powerful in the countryside than in the city, because the city was much more crowded. There was never such a thing like the hegemony of one clan. There could be properly, yes, leadership was of course embodied by the most powerful clans, but it's not before the 15th century that we see a single family actually ruling the entire city, because they actually bought it off. We're talking about the Medici, by the way, in Florence. Something completely different from this. That was like, in fact, a sum of different clans living in extending on a large territory, not just the city per se, even though it was the most remunerative place to be in. That's why they would accept that risk too. And that's why we're not talking about a state yet, because again, it's as if it was, again, feudalism, so privatization, private system, filling something that was in theory public, or almost, because yes, the commune again was taking a profile, it was ever more public in face, but technically it was a pure invention that the Italians made that before didn't exist. The city was just, but the only public thing that existed was the diocese and the comital district, in terms of properly a traditional institution, the institutional administration in line. So even the mindset of the nobleman remains extremely violent for this reason, because there is an interesting change that occurs in the city. The city develops historically everywhere because of the wealth, the surplus that is accumulated there for the market, etc. Essentially for logistical reasons. So somebody starts living there permanently and building, etc. And so there was a refinement in culture. I mean, the ideals of courtesy that were of feudal origin, but they would had a dramatic grip also on the urban patriciate historically, and so much that the same urban patriciate would eventually influence the feudal elite in turn. I mean, between Italy and France, this was quite evident throughout all the late Middle Ages, especially that the elite is the elite pretty much everywhere, and tends, like the feudal lords of military origin tend to become more kind of urban and courteous in real terms, whereas the what were previously just merchants and commoners tend to also to militarize themselves a bit more, to have that kind of chivalric lifestyle, more like the elite was meant to have. Also because they literally had that degree of responsibility also to take up arms when it was needed, as they had to defend the prerogatives they had earned, they had acquired, they had taken, also with the sword in the process, by the way. And there is also a feeling, in fact, that times change, right? Not everybody was happy to see all that wealth around, not because they wouldn't be actually the first ones to benefit from it, but because it's a bit like today. There aren't all the good old morals of one time. And it is kind of true, but this is mostly an individual perspective. And of course, yes, we don't have the individual qualities of life, and that's a serious problem. And the crisis is always struck because of that reason, but still because you belong to a system that is dramatically more advanced than everything existed before. And so you find even, I don't know, Dante complaining of the time where, there were also this luxury limitations, right? Sumptuary laws and things like that. Because the older ideal was really the simple, pure, traditional one of the freeman warrior that lived of honor, of clarity, of reason, of virtue, right? And that would just not even need the regulation of a state of something. Instead, the compression of all these people, all these interests, and all this wealth in a city would naturally bring to conflict, and from conflict you have solutions, improvements, and new moral forces concentrated. That's the reason why the older military lifestyle on the longer run would become obsolete. That is the idea of the knight, of the lord, of this kind of individualistic warrior that lives out of his own prestige and honor, and that takes everything as as an offense that has to wash in blood. It was like, we can't go on like that, especially when, again, these clans made those terrible urban confrontations, which parts of the city went burned, destroyed, or things like that. And so a greater force, which is the force of a state, of a higher authority, has to be created. And that's the reason why the same militas, after all, had been evolving in political factions that had become ever more powerful, and that were threatening, in fact, even to take over the city government. However, in times where the city was becoming, again, ever more crowded and therefore ever more unstable. And these political factions were the center around which the interests, not only of the older and the newer consortes, but also those who lived at their own dependence in their own circle, orbitated. Reason for which the system is also, yes, it's kind of more unstable in a way, but it has also kind of more means to absorb the conflict, right? There are those bad situations where really a lot of blood would run, but at the same time, if you want to build up the state, it's not by killing people. It's by actually coming together and saying, okay, yeah, it's kind of more convenient for me to agree on this, and I give you this if you give me that, and so we can negotiate. And that's the massive, even in there, resource that is put together to concentrate power for everybody, to create a higher arbiter, a higher mean of control. In fact, what this would evolve like, as we've seen also in other videos, is the figure of the podestat. That was nothing but essentially a military leader. I mean, originally he would always had to be kind of experienced in law by a certain degree. He had, in fact, always a retinue of jurists coming from him. This was a guy coming literally from another city, because it was thought that in this way he wouldn't be interested in the local feuds, etc. And there were people and families that would make, in fact, a multi-generational career based on that, where, say, a certain city, maybe, just making completely random, Florence, let's say, at some point began to call podestats from Mantua, and traditionally, they would call it also from other places, but that family from Mantua would normally go to Florence, and also there, naturally, some bonds would form, but it were based on reliability. And initially, it was about keeping the city in peace, even just in terms of police force, and kind of presenting this higher arbiter that the same factions would kind of say, yeah, it's better to have this guy than killing each other all the time, so that at least we self-discipline ourselves, which is a big deal, civilizationally speaking. But the podestats that wouldn't be enough, right? The podestats actually increase their own political and military power. Some of them would become lords later on. But essentially, to maintain this degree of public control, given that they were always under the eyes of the council and of the statutes of the city, because that's the point. There was a massive statutory production, because, again, these systems were enormous. Even just economically speaking, they needed an enormous regulation, written production, documentation, etc. And they were put essentially in charge of the army. That is, they were prevented from taking over the system, of course, with private possessions and everything, but they would be mostly military commanders that would have to guide the army in battle during the campaign, actually. And this was very important, because it makes you understand, as always in Clausewitzian terms, that if you have a politically divided reality, also your military action would be crippled by that. So you need a single commander in moment of danger, of emergency, and hopefully a good one to fight successfully. And so this is how the same discipline to the Italian armies would increase. And this is in fact a time in which, at least this would happen mostly from the second half of the 13th century, which in fact a real state was formed, when you see that, for example, separation between cavalry and infantry didn't quite exist anymore, tactically wise, because they would cooperate. They would be solidly anchored to one another, and that's the reason why you wouldn't have, revolts like in Flanders, where just the commoners would rebel to the elite, because they had settled the matter. And that doesn't actually even measure in absolute terms the strength of those infantries. In fact, these infantries kept evolving dramatically, even when they were under cavalry, because they were expression of a more cohesive community and a better, quite solidly hierarchical one, that had even, in fact, managed to create armies that, again, do not compare in terms even just of this region produces easily the largest amount of armored forces in relative terms in Europe at the time. And it's impressive because it's all the enormous wealth that the cities had capitalized through international trade, agriculture, etc., banking, and it was enormous. And what would happen is they started, of course, to make war against one another. When the German emperors were defeated, what do Italians do? They start fighting each other, right? As they would do on a regular basis also before, but with ever more resources. That is to say, if you look at, the resources that were spent for the wars against Frederick Barbarossa, one against Frederick II, and then the one against each other in the second half of the 13th century, you see that there is an exponential increase. That makes you understand also, in fact, how the growth of the cities was fundamentally in the, yes, it was connected to the international situation, but it was just happening on its own, right? It was really unstoppable, and in fact, not even the largest power in Europe, that was, in fact, Germany in the second half of the 12th century, had managed to curb them, to stop them. And this is really, again, this is one of the reasons why this page is so important. And what is interesting as well is that the political factions that we have described from the aristocratic side began to organize themselves with their own magistracies. That is to say, they began to create kind of mini-states within the same commune. And they associate themselves in a unique group known as Societas militum, or pars nobilium. We'll explain now. Essentially competing simultaneously among each other, mostly, as long as the people didn't become dangerous enough to actually to turn arms against them, for the power in the city. Now, Societas militum or pars nobilium means literally, in fact, the knightly society, respectively, and the faction of the nobles, right? So milites and nobiles here are somewhat overlapping, even though the concept is different, because the milites would be as such just by census. That is, how rich you are, you have to serve on horseback, or even sending somebody in your stead for that. And again, it's actually a privilege. So that this is the period in which people want to become milites, because they know what's their share from that status. The nobiles are something, say, more vaguely defined, because again, the nobility wasn't quite there in juridical terms, especially given that most of these people were not part of noble lineages, historically speaking. I mean, there were, yes, in Italy there were some great feudal families of all about Montferrat, but let's say they also intervene in the city politics. I made a video about that on the case of Vercelli and the city tax, and Boniface V of Montferrat. But the nobility in this sense is more vague, generally speaking. The milites are not really, that they can't even really trace. I mean, the even the familiar memory is somewhat short. Just goes in terms of a life memory, right? The important is that they're powerful in life, not really what. And so nobility here, however, is being defined further because naturally the aristocracy grows more powerful, and so being part of that clan means to be noble per se, or at least you belong to that higher power that is being defined as noble exactly because it has greater political leverage. And as we've seen, the purpose is the compaction for fighting each other was necessary in that dramatically violent lifestyle. And in the meanwhile, there is also a various convergency with the class of the great merchants and moneylenders that are in their own turn, ambiguously located a bit between the nobility and the people, because they are really not often part of the military clans, but they start to be rich enough, and so there is some kind of gray area where some of them are co-opted, others not. In fact, even the people were these were people, right? So there were actually also other groups further on. It's the magnate that is indicated properly as the too powerful of a guy that has to be checked, and then there is the rest of the nobility, and this kind of partly overlaps with the people. And there's not really a fixed status because this would be defined contingentally, right? People would be banned sometimes, would be declared such, would be simply seen as such, and so the important was really just the power ratios within the city, and not really the whatever these people qualified on paper, I guess, individuals. So on another video we will see at some point, I don't know when, also a bit better in fact the popular element, which is kind of in fact misunderstood. These are not the shoemakers, right? It maybe in the first generation they kind of were, in terms of there was more like the artisan element within it, was more like a class struggle, but the people that eventually would take over were actually just kind of much more inclusive and say more heterogeneous in terms of social origin, but also already hierarchicized one group that wouldn't be that similar, actually would become even more powerful than one of the milites, because they had milites literally on their own. So that's a quite relevant change that we've seen it here and there. But again, I care about making these videos to see step by step, one thing at a time, what happened, because again, this general picture is necessary, then we will get into the actual details. Like, I plan for every single power in Europe to make to an indefinite extreme actually a pretty in-depth analysis of it, and all the Italian communes actually are on the list. So this is gonna be fun if we're gonna making that. But for the rest, it's important to conceptualize, first of all, that these things existed, because again, I've never heard or read anything on the internet about this stuff, unless it's some academic publication, an extremely niche thing on academia.edu, etc. But again, nobody really cares. The Middle Ages for people is mostly the Vikings, and point. Right? That's it. Or some kind of 15th century full plate armor guy, jousting, and that's it. Right? No, the Middle Ages are much more, but overwhelmingly more than that, and so it's necessary, really, to know. However, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.